So continuing on how changing rates in development can cause the changes in these homologous limbs that we see in these representative vertebrates. What can happen is with increased growth rates, you can get longer finger bones, like in the batwing or in the whale flipper, or with decreasing the growth rates of the leg and or pelvic bones, you get the reduction, the vestigial structures of the hind limbs in your whales. Again, by controlling developmental processes in the embryo. There's a phenomenon called pediomorphosis or pediomorphosis. What this is the retention in the adult of body structures that were juvenile features in ancestral previous species. And this has occurred in the evolution of the salamander called the axolotl, native of Mexico, and in humans. So gills are juvenile structures in juvenile salamanders. But what happens with, or what has happened evolutionary with this salamander, since it's aquatic, living in water, it retained a juvenile structure, the gills, because it helps it breathe in the water. And again, this is through the maintenance and the continued development or expression of a gene that produces the gills throughout the life of the animal, okay? Not just during a juvenile stage. Or if we consider a human and chimpanzee, the fetal skull, and at birth, they're very similar, very rounded cranium. But after birth, what happens at the developmental rate, or with the developmental rate with some of the facial bones, in particular the jawbone, the mandible, and the upper bone, something called the maxilla, is that the growth rate of those bone structures in the eyebrow are increased relative to a human. So with a human, you get a skull that has a very pronounced round cranium, not that different from a fetal skull. But with a chimpanzee, you get a much enlarged facial bone structure compared to the fetus. And again, it's because of differential growth patterns, developmental, well, no, actually after birth, but growth patterns in these facial bones. While in the human, we're basically retaining some of the juvenile or even fetal features. So we have pediomorphic features in the skull. So a little bit on this differential growth patterns in humans.
An organism's shape depends partly on allometric growth, the variation in rates of growth of various parts of the body. Even slight changes in the relative rates can result in dramatic differences in adult forms. This can be seen in human evolution when we observe facial development of chimpanzees compared to humans. In both species, the fetus skulls are rounded with small jaws, resulting in a flat, rounded face. As chimp development proceeds, uneven bone growth results in a sharply angular skull with heavy brow ridges and massive jaws. As human development proceeds, the adult skull retains the rounder shape and small jaw with more fetus-like contours.
Okay, some good visuals there. So, evolution of biological novelty. So, a new use of certain features or structures. So how do we account for the dramatic differences between dissimilar groups, like the hippopotamus and the whales, which are actually not that distantly related, but they look very distinctly different, or different eye structures in different types of organisms. So focusing on the adaptation of an old structure for a new function. Excuse me. So feathered flights in birds is a perfect example of how structure and function correlate with each other. The shape of the feathers, especially as they cover a wing, the forelimb of a bird, provide the perfect structure for the function of flight, provides a really good airfoil, analogous to a plane's wing. So in flight, the shape and the arrangements of various feathers produce lift, an upward force, and a smooth airflow that minimizes drag due to turbulence and provides a wonderful structural shape for the wing that allows it to perform the function of flight in birds. So how did such an intricate structure evolve in terms of the feathers in flying birds? Well, interestingly, feathers apparently did not evolve for flight. So the reptilian features that are apparent in the fossil, the famous fossil called Archaeopteryx, one of the earliest birds in terms of fossils, offers some clues. So Archaeopteryx has some reptilian features like teeth and a long tail with many vertebrae, which are reptilian type structures. Claws on their forelimbs, which are also like reptiles, but yet the animal is highly feathered, which is very bird-like. So there have been, after Archaeopteryx, there have been many thousands of fossils of feathered birds that have been found for more than 30 different species, and they find more and more all the time. And they have even found bits of fossilized dinosaurs with bird-like features in amber, with finely detailed feathers that have been preserved. So, but the feathers in these fossils are not structurally the type that would provide a structure for flight, because their anatomy was too light. So the first feathers that evolved, or feathers when they first evolved on the ancestors of birds, structurally could not have been for flight, which means they evolved for another purpose. So their first use might have been for insulation. Some biologists think that they were possibly for display, like sexual selection. So that's still up to debate. But once flight itself became advantageous, then natural selection would have gradually helped remodel the shape of the feathers and the wing to fit an additional function, and that would be of flight. So if we look here at the evolutionary tree, or phylogeny of some dinosaurs, we see that some dinosaurs were not feathered, and the evolution of feathers appeared prior to the evolution of some very famous dinosaurs like T-Rex. So T-Rex has been found with clear evidence of feathers. Here is Archaeopteryx. So some of the dinosaurs that were smaller in size were able to develop the ability to glide, and then eventually the development of wings and feathers that allowed them to have full-fledged flight. And again, or some birds are amazing flyers, like hummingbirds, which can hover, fly straight up, straight down, forwards, and backwards. So this process where a structure, a feature, first of all for one function and then switches to another function, is called exaptation. So exaptations are structures such as feathers that evolve for one function or context, but become functional for a different purpose, so become co-opted for another function. So feathers is an example of an exaptation. If we think about the development of an elaborate structure like the eye, how that occurred, it was through gradual evolutionary changes and refinements and developments. So the most complex structures evolved through small evolutionary steps from simpler versions, through a process of refinement, natural selection, versus a sudden appearance of complexity, which is not the way some of these elaborate structures developed. So if we consider the complex eye of like a squid or an octopus, if we look at an evolutionary lineage and of examples of visual structures in some living organisms, we can see that the simplest type of visual system is simply a collection of pigmented cells, and pigments are types of molecules that absorb light. So the pigmented cells absorb light and generate an electrical signal, a nerve impulse to the nervous system or the brain of the animal. That's how our eyes work, actually, except they're more complex structure. From that, we can get the development of an eye cup, which allows for a slightly better visual function. The pigmented cells simply allow something like a limpet to detect shade and light, but not really to determine sharp figures. Okay, so from an eye cup, we can get to a simple pinhole eye structure, which is a better visual system than the eye cup. And then an eye with a primitive lens, which allows something like the marine snail to have a pretty good visual system to focus on structures, all the way to a pretty complex camera lens type eye, similar to ours, with an elaborate lens and what's referred to as a pupil to regulate the amount of light that comes in. And squids and octopuses, which are very good hunters, have a very good visual system, just like we do. Here's a human eye for comparison. So the evolution of complex eyes traced from a single patch of photoreceptive cells through a series of incremental modification, changes, etc., that benefited their owners at each stage of development, especially evolutionarily. Okay? So, quick review of taxonomy, which we covered in a previous structure. Naming and classification of species, set up by Carolyn Linnaeus, the Linnaean system of binomial nomenclature. We talked a little bit about systematics. So taxonomy, looking at the relationship of organisms and focusing on clarifying which organisms have clear evolutionary relationships. So this evolutionary tree, also called a phylogeny, shows the relationships between the leopard, Panthera pardus. Notice that's the species name, binomial nomenclature, Panthera pardus. The genus name is capitalized. The species name is not, and it's written in italics. Here's a skunk. Here's a European otter, fairly closely related. Here's a coyote and a wolf, fairly closely related. But we have to go back a fair amount of time to look at the common ancestor of all these animals. So the Panthera belongs into the Felidae family, the cat family. The skunk and the otter belong to this family, Mustelidae. And then down here, the coyote and wolf belong to this family, the Canidae, the canids, the dogs. But we have to go back. Notice how the branching speciation events have led to these guys. If we go backwards in time, we can see that there's a common ancestor to all these guys, which belongs in the order Carnivora. Some ancestral carnivore was the common ancestor to all these members. And then there are other close relatives which are not shown in this relatively simple family evolutionary tree. So again, as I mentioned a few times, these are called phylogenies. So these are phylogenetic trees, and they're, excuse me, they are hypotheses about the evolutionary history of the species and the hierarchical classification groups that they belong to, set up initially by Linnaeus in his early taxonomic work. So homologous structures are useful in establishing phylogenies, these evolutionary family trees, because homologous structures, as we've mentioned before in different species, have a somewhat similar form and function to a certain degree because they have a common ancestor. So they do have some basic similarities. For example, the number of bones, as we've talked about, in the upper arm and lower arm, and in their